Really much tervepä terve again. Today I'm going to show you how to use the OData endpoint of D365 portals. The OData endpoint is used and published mainly for easy retrieval of data from Dynamics, and that can be used in the portal pages and forms. The scenario today that I'm going to use is actually the kind where I have, this is my portal here, and I would like to populate the territory information to a lookup field in an account form of a portal. And the way that I'm going to use it, the territory information, is that I would like to fetch the portal logged on users account and then use that account's territory data from Dynamics and populate that over to the account form in portals. And that cannot be done by just using a JavaScript in the portal form, because the territory information is not available in the form itself on the client side. So this must be done somehow by querying the data from the server side. And this OData endpoint of the portal is easy to use, and it's actually a REST-based protocol that can be used to query data. And of course we can utilize the logged on users basic information in the parameters of the OData query that we do. So if I show you the portal form which I'm going to use, I have it configured here. This is my sample portal. So I have the My Devices listing here. These are customer assets actually from the field service module of Dynamics. And I, for example, open here one customer asset, and I have an account field here in the customer asset form of the portal. So basically, when user selects an account for this account field, there's a possibility, I've configured it so that user can actually create a new account. And over here, I would like to have the territory lookup field to be pre-populated using the logged on users accounts territory. So as you know, the portal users are actually contacts. So there's the parent account of the contact, and then that parent account contains the territory which I'm going to use here. Okay, so if I go back to the OData feed and how it's used, so basically in the dynamic side, I go first to the portals configuration, and first of all I need to have an entity listing for this account entity type so that I can configure the OData endpoint for the account entity. So I have it already here. I have accounts entity listing over here, and when I open that in the Dynamics view and scroll down a bit towards the end of the form, there is the OData feed section over here. And this is the place where I actually configure and enable the OData endpoint for account entity. I can specify the entity type name, which is of course the schema name of the Dynamics entity. Then I can set the entity set name, which is an important piece of information when I configure the actual OData query. I will show you that in a moment. And then I need to select the Dynamics view, which is used to fetch the actual data from the OData endpoint. So basically this is the Dynamics view, which has of course columns, and those columns will be the data that I will be getting from the OData query. For this purpose, I've already configured a view called Portal Accounts, and that view has only two columns, the account name and the territory. So this is already done over there, and the way then which I'm going to use and fetch the data is from the account form, the portal form. using a JavaScript. But before we go into that, I will show you how we can actually test this OData endpoint in a browser after you have enabled this OData feed here in the entity listing of the portal. So basically there is an URL which can be used in a browser to test this OData endpoint, and I have already configured that, or I have a query here available. So this is my portal URL, the basic URL here. Then after that there is the OData folder or part of the URL, and then I specify the view name, or actually the dataset name, which I had over here. So entity set name that I have here is accounts, so that's the next part of the URL. And then the actual query, this is the REST-based query part. So I have the filter over there, and I'm going to use the name attribute as the filter. And for sample purposes, I have a Coho Winery account in this Dynamics instance here. So I would like to query the information of Coho Winery account using the filter account name. So I copy this over to my clipboard and then go back to the browser and open a new browser tab and copy and paste this URL into the address bar of the browser. And as you can see, I got the information from the OData feed. So basically, as I mentioned, I had two attributes or columns in that view there. There was the account name and then the territory. And from the territory, as you know, it's a lookup field of the account, so it returns the GUID of the territory and the name of it. Here in this case, for this account, the selected territory is Finland. And on top of those, the feed always returns the entity primary key. The GUID of the account is then here also used or shown. And actually, one more thing which I would like to mention is that these OData feed queries are case sensitive. So this was one thing which I ran into in the beginning when I started using these. So this has to be, you need to be careful with the queries that you build. So as you can see here, the entity set name that I used here was with uppercase A in the beginning. So if, for example, I would specify lowercase a here in the query, that should probably return an error. So there is no data set with the uppercase a in the, lowercase a, the URL. So that's basically it, how you test it in a browser. And of course you can build any kind of queries. This was very simple one, but more complex ones can of course be done. And as I mentioned, it's a REST-based query, so very easy to build. So next part is the JavaScript, which is used then in the account form to populate the territory lookup field. So I go back to my Dynamics here and the portals section and then the entity form. So that's the account form now, which I showed you in the beginning. That was the kind of like a pop-up dialog window for specifying the new account data when user actually wants to add a new account, the customer, for the customer asset. So I have the account portal form here already configured, and the mode of it is insert, so it's basically meant for inserting new accounts. And when I open that here in Dynamics side, again towards the bottom part of the form here, there is the custom JavaScript field, which can be used to insert custom JavaScript into the form. And I have actually the JavaScript here already, so I go briefly through the syntax of the JavaScript here. So basically, first I use the user variable here, which can be used in the portal forms to get the logged on users information. And there is an attribute called parent customer ID. As I mentioned, the portal users are contacts of CRM, so there's always the parent customer ID there. Of course, it's not always there if the contact doesn't have the parent customer, but in this case I have it configured so I can use that. So in the real world example, you would be using an if clause there to make sure that you won't run into the error if the parent customer ID would not exist. The next part, when I have the account GUID or account name, I can use either one of those. I can use that variable in the filter. So as I mentioned in the beginning and showed you in the browser test, this is very similar. So the filter part is the account name equals the variable which I fetched from the logged on user's parent customer ID name. Then the next part, I have the basic URL of the OData endpoint, and then I concatenate the filter part of it to the query, and of course it needs to be URL encoded, so that was the way that I showed you already that also in the browser. The next one, it's the AJAX call, so that's done, and of course it's done in an async way, so it's not an instant, the value will not be populated instantly there, but the delay is not that bad, so at least here in my scenario it's acceptable. I will show you that in a moment how it works. And finally, when I run the query, then I get back the data from there, and from the data value I pick the first occurrence of the account territory, and of course there's only one of those for one account, so it's safe to pick the first occurrence, the order number 0, and from there I get the territory ID, the GUID, and the territory name from the name attribute. And then finally I populate it to the portal form lookup field, and the portal form lookup fields are populated so that first you give the GUID, and then you give the name of the actual value, and finally the entity name, which is then territory here in my case. That's hard coded here, and then some error handling in the bottom part. So I copy and paste this script to the dynamic side. As I mentioned, here is the place for custom JavaScript, and now when I've added that over here and I save the changes, I go back to the portal side, but before that I clear the cache of the portal page. So that's important piece to remember, part to remember before testing anything, because the browser will cache lots of things from the portal pages, and also there's a server-side cache that needs to be emptied. So now I'll go back to my portal and refresh the page again, also the legendary Control F5, and I have the customer asset here again shown. And now when I go to the account lookup again, if this works and I click the new, and new account creation form will be opened, the territory field should be pre-populated with my logged on users parent account's territory. So let's see if it works. In the first time it takes a while to load it, but as you saw, there was not much of a delay to populate the territory information for the lookup field. Actually, one more thing which I would like to show you is that how you can again use the browser developer tools to see actually what is transmitted over to the OData feed when the query is done from the browser. So I go back to my URL again, which is here, the URL encoded, coded part, and then I open this one here again to see the actual results. I open the developer tools and refresh the query, and now I have the actual query here open in the browser DevTools. So here you can investigate what kind of data is actually transmitted over, and we are especially interested the query part of it. This is the response part, but here is the request part. So as you can see, the actual data that is submitted over contains the query itself, but the cookie is the important piece of it, as it relates to the authentication of the OData feed. So if you wouldn't have a session open and active for the browser, I mean the portal, then of course you would get an error, authentication error. So that is naturally needed for getting data from the feed itself. And this browser tool, developer tools, you can of course use to investigate other attributes about the request that is transmitted over to the server side, the OData feed part on the server itself. So that's it. This is very quick sample of the OData endpoint and how to use it with the Dynamics 365 portal forms. I find it very useful tool for fetching data for this type of scenarios where the data that you would need is not instantly available on the client side, where you could use just client-side scripts, but instead you need to query data from the server side, and this web services, REST web services OData endpoint is easy to use tool for doing such queries. Hopefully you got the idea how to use those, and for more complex scenarios it's also easily expandable, extendable way, and you find lots of information in the web for this subject to get more information. So thank you for watching and have a great day.